At the very beginning of the story, we see a group of astronauts who have traveled to Mars and are collecting soil samples because they plan to bring the soil back to Earth for research. Just then, they receive an emergency alert informing them that a massive storm is likely to hit the area. Therefore, without wasting any time, they must immediately return to their spaceship. As a result, all of the astronauts make their way back to the spaceship one by one. However, one astronaut is unable to make it back. He gets caught in the storm midway and disappears somewhere. Meanwhile, the astronauts who have returned to the spaceship are unable to contact him despite repeated attempts. Eventually, they lose all hope of finding him and assume that their teammate, whose name is Mark, has died. With no other option, they begin their journey back to Earth. However, in the very next scene, it is revealed that Mark is still alive. During the storm, a sharp object had pierced his body, but he painfully pulls it out. Afterward, he makes his way to a nearby shelter that had been built by the astronauts. Inside, Earth-like gravity and atmospheric conditions have been artificially created. After entering the shelter, he becomes extremely worried because he knows that the next mission to Mars will not arrive for another 4 years. But how is he supposed to survive for that long? The amount of food stored inside the shelter is nowhere near enough to keep him alive for 4 years. So, no matter what, he has to find a way to produce food for himself. He then takes a few raw potatoes from the food supply stored in the shelter and decides to grow potatoes there. But to do that, he needs water, fertile soil, and an Earth-like atmosphere, none of which exist on Mars. Even so, he refuses to give up and begins preparing for farming. He seals off a section of the shelter with plastic and artificially creates an Earth-like environment inside it. Next, he needs water. However, there isn't enough water available for farming. There is only enough to meet his drinking needs. But Mark knows how to make water, and he already has all the necessary materials. So, he combines hydrogen and oxygen and ignites the mixture in an attempt to produce water, which results in a massive explosion. Although Mark had calculated the correct amount of hydrogen and oxygen, the explosion happens because the oxygen level inside the shelter has decreased due to his own breathing. Even after the explosion, Mark refuses to give up and tries again. This time, he succeeds. Tiny droplets of water begin to form as vapor, providing him with all the water he needs for farming. Within a few days, the first potato sprouts emerge, and Mark is overjoyed to see them. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Mark is officially declared dead, and a memorial is even built in his honor. Then one day, satellite engineer Mindy notices something unusual. Some of the equipment that had been sent from Earth and left on Mars is no longer where it was originally placed. In fact, several solar panels have been moved to a different location. It turns out that Mark relocated them himself, taking them wherever he needed them. Mindy immediately calls in her senior officers to show them what she has found, and they quickly realize that Mark is still alive on Mars. However, Senior Officer Teddy says that even though they now know Mark is alive, there is nothing they can do to help him. Even if they launch a rescue mission immediately, Mark will die of hunger and thirst long before they can reach him. That's because it takes several months to travel from Earth to Mars, and Mark simply doesn't have enough food to survive that long. It's already been 70 days. Mark is still alone on Mars. He calculates that the spaceship scheduled to be sent from Earth in 4 years will land about 3,200 kilometers away from his current location. That means he has to reach that landing site before it arrives. It will take him a total of 50 days to get there because the vehicle he has can't travel very far in a single day. The vehicle runs on solar power, and its battery also has to be recharged using solar energy. At the same time, people on Earth were making plans to send food to Mark. It would take a total of 3 months to complete all the necessary preparations. Then, the spacecraft would need another 9 months to travel from Earth to Mars. In other words, the entire process would take a total of 1 year. Meanwhile, another 48 days pass for Mark on Mars, and the crops he planted grow significantly. He successfully grows a total of 400 potato plants, something even he never thought would be possible. Mark manages to harvest far more potatoes than he had originally expected. He then harvests all the potatoes and carefully selects the smaller ones to plant again. But how long could he survive by eating nothing but potatoes? If he couldn't provide his body with all the nutrients it needed, he would eventually become sick. Desperate to establish contact with Earth, Mark heads to a place where the Pathfinder probe, which had been sent to Mars in 1997, had been lying abandoned in a damaged condition. He repairs it and manages to get it working again. Mark knows that it is a very old piece of equipment and that it cannot send anything to Earth except a few low-quality images. So he turns on the Pathfinder's camera, writes messages on 3 sheets of paper, places them in front of the camera, and waits for a response from Earth. On the middle sheet of paper, Mark writes, "Can you receive my signal?" On one of the other 2 sheets, he writes, "Yes," and on the other, "No." A few moments later, the Pathfinder's camera turns toward the sheet labeled "Yes." That means the people on Earth can see Mark. The moment he realizes this, he jumps with joy. After that, Mark begins communicating with them using a coded system because making video calls or audio calls through the Pathfinder is impossible. Through the coded messages, the team on Earth informs Mark that NASA is arranging to send him the supplies and food he needs. They also tell him that his crewmates, the people who went on the Mars mission with him, are still aboard their spacecraft. They have not yet returned to Earth, and they have not been told that Mark is still alive. Soon afterward, NASA informs Mark's crewmates that he is still alive. They are overjoyed to hear the news, but at the same time, they feel deeply guilty because they were the ones who had mistakenly left Mark behind on Mars. Anyway, Mark is now very happy. He records a video of the potato crop he successfully grew using a camera. But unfortunately, the very next day, an explosion occurs in the area where Mark had grown the potatoes, destroying his entire crop. As a result, it is no longer possible for him to grow potatoes there a second time. This is because the Earth-like environment Mark had created inside the shelter using all the available resources is now completely ruined. Mark then calculates that the amount of potatoes he has left is not enough to keep him alive until help arrives from Earth. So, NASA tells Mark that from now on, he must eat as little as possible and ration his food carefully so he can survive for as long as possible. They explain that a new food supply is being sent to Mars, and no matter what, he has to stay alive until it reaches him. Mark follows their advice. Instead of eating 3 full meals a day, he divides what used to be 1 meal into 3 small portions and starts eating those throughout the day. Meanwhile, back on Earth, NASA sends a spaceship loaded with the supplies and food that Mark desperately needs. But unfortunately, just moments after launch, the spacecraft explodes high in the sky. Once again, everyone loses hope because now it seems there is no chance left for Mark to survive. After hearing the devastating news, Mark is completely heartbroken. He sends NASA a message for his parents. In it, he asks them not to grieve over his death. He says that he truly loves his work and has always been dedicated to it. And even if he dies, his death will serve a greater purpose, one that is far more valuable than his own life. That's why, even in a situation like this, he refuses to give up and continues fighting for survival. After everything that has happened, NASA finally begins to lose all hope. But then China decides to help Mark, because their spacecraft is already fully prepared for launch. 28 days later, with China's assistance, NASA prepares to launch another supply mission. Meanwhile, a young astrodynamics specialist named Rich arrives with a much faster rescue plan. He explains that instead of allowing the returning spacecraft to come all the way back to Earth, it should remain in orbit around the planet. During that time, NASA can deliver fresh supplies and food to the spacecraft. Then, using a slingshot maneuver, they can redirect it back toward Mars. A slingshot maneuver uses a planet's gravitational pull to change a spacecraft's direction and speed, allowing it to travel through space more efficiently without using much additional fuel. Rich also explains that when the crew heads back toward Mars, they must not land on the planet. If they do, their spacecraft will run out of fuel, making it impossible for them to ever return to Earth. Instead, Mark will have to leave Mars on his own and escape the planet's gravitational pull. To do that, he must use the MAV, a spacecraft that has already been stationed on Mars. Once Mark reaches a point beyond Mars's gravity, the incoming spacecraft will be able to intercept him and pull him aboard. Although the plan sounds simple, carrying it out is incredibly difficult. NASA's officials initially reject Rich's proposal. They argue that they cannot risk the lives of 5 astronauts just to save 1 person. However, if they choose this plan, the crew would be able to reach Mark in time. The downside is that the spacecraft, which is already close to returning to Earth's gravitational field, would have to extend its mission by another 533 days. After a long discussion, NASA ultimately decides not to go through with the plan because they are unwilling to risk the lives of 5 astronauts solely to save Mark. Meanwhile, Mark gets back to work. The mission that Mark's team had been sent to Mars to complete was left unfinished because of the storm. So now, Mark begins completing those tasks one by one. Meanwhile, the boy named Rich, who had previously suggested using the slingshot maneuver to rescue Mark but had his plan rejected by NASA, finally completes his proposal and sends it to Mark's crewmates, who are still traveling back to Earth aboard their spacecraft. This time, the 5 astronauts decide to rescue Mark without waiting for NASA's permission. When the NASA team notices that the astronaut spacecraft has changed course, they realize that they are heading back to rescue Mark. So, NASA also sends Mark's essential supplies and food to their spacecraft. To make this possible, China helps NASA by providing the spacecraft they had prepared. Meanwhile, on Mars, Mark begins making his way toward the small spacecraft called the MAV. He knows that this spacecraft can never take him all the way back to Earth. It can only carry him to the edge of Mars's gravitational pull. Once he gets there, all he has to do is meet up with Hermes. Hermes is the same spacecraft that brought Mark and his 5 crewmates to Mars. And now, those same 5 astronauts are returning aboard it to bring him home. After 90 days, Mark finally reaches the small spacecraft called the MAV, but once he gets there, he realizes that it doesn't have nearly enough solid fuel to escape Mars's gravity. In fact, it can't even make it halfway. So, to make the spacecraft as light as possible, Mark starts throwing out every heavy object inside it, because no matter what happens, he has to make it out of Mars's orbit. Otherwise, if his 5 crewmates are forced to land on Mars, they will use up all of their remaining solid fuel. And if that happens, none of them will ever be able to return to Earth. So, with no other choice, Mark takes an incredibly dangerous risk and prepares the spacecraft for launch. At this point, the entire world is watching this mission. Mark then lifts off from the surface of Mars, and his spacecraft begins soaring into space. Meanwhile, his 5 astronaut crewmates try to contact him over the radio, but because of the tremendous pressure created by the spacecraft's rapid acceleration, Mark loses consciousness. As a result, he is unable to communicate with them. Fortunately, after a short while, Mark regains consciousness, and they finally establish contact. The moment they hear each other's voices again, everyone is filled with relief and joy. However, another problem soon appears. Mark's spacecraft is traveling so fast that he won't be able to stop at the correct position. So he says, "Once I reach 0 gravity, I'll leave my spacecraft. Then I'll puncture my spacesuit to create thrust with the escaping air and slowly propel myself toward you." But his 5 crewmates immediately tell him not to do it. Their own spacecraft is also moving at an incredible speed. So instead, they detonate a small explosive and blow off part of their spacecraft. The explosion slows the spacecraft down just enough. Now, they can clearly see Mark slowly drifting toward them through space. The commander then climbs into a flying jet and begins floating toward Mark. But after traveling a certain distance, the safety tether attached to the jet reaches its limit. At that point, reaching Mark becomes impossible. That's when Mark does exactly what he had suggested earlier. He punctures his spacesuit, leaves his spacecraft, and uses the escaping air as thrust to propel himself toward the commander. But just as Mark grabs the commander's hand, his grip slips, and he begins drifting away into space. Thankfully, Mark manages to catch hold of the tether attached to the commander's spacesuit. At last, Mark successfully makes it back to his old crewmates and reunites with the very same spacecraft that had brought him to Mars. After returning safely to Earth, Mark becomes an instructor for future astronauts. And with that, the movie comes to an end. So, if you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe for more awesome content. I'll see you guys in the next one.